I set his coffee down without a word. That was the morning of my son's promotion dinner, the night Margaret decided to remind everyone at the table exactly who she thought she was. I had known Margaret for 11 years. My son Daniel brought her home on a rainy Thursday in October, the kind of evening where the whole city of Ottawa smells like wet leaves and wood smoke, and I remember thinking she had a nice handshake. Firm. Direct. I appreciated that. I told myself, this woman will be good for him. I was wrong about that. Not about the handshake, about what it meant. Daniel is my youngest. He works in federal procurement, and after 11 years of careful, quiet work, he had just been appointed senior director. It was a significant position. It came with real responsibility and a salary that meant he could finally stop worrying about his mortgage. I was proud of him in the way that settles deep into your chest and stays there. The kind of proud that has nothing to do with money or titles, just the particular satisfaction of watching someone you raised choose integrity over shortcuts, year after year, until the world finally noticed. The dinner was Margaret's idea. She organized everything, the private room at the restaurant in Westboro, the guest list, the flowers. I told her I was happy to help, and she smiled and said, "Oh, you don't need to worry about a thing, Carol." She called me Carol. My name is Catherine. I corrected her twice in the first year. After that, I stopped. My husband passed 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. Since then, it has been Daniel and my daughter Joanne and me, and we have managed the 3 of us. We are not a wealthy family. My husband was a high school history teacher in Nepean for 31 years, and I worked part-time in medical records at the Civic Hospital until my knees made standing difficult. We owned a small semi-detached on Marival Road, paid it off, lived carefully, never asked anyone for anything. I am not ashamed of any of that, not a single day of it. Margaret's family is from West Vancouver. Her father ran a wealth management firm. She grew up in a house with a name, not just an address. She skied at Whistler every February and spent summers on the Sunshine Coast. None of that is a crime, but Margaret wore it the way some people wear a coat that is 2 sizes too large, constantly adjusting it, making sure everyone in the room could see the label. I noticed it early, the way she would mention in casual conversation the value of her parents' property, the way she would describe my son's previous apartment as cozy, the pause before that word doing considerable work. The way she once looked at the quilt my mother made, folded over the arm of my sofa and said, "Oh, is that handmade? How sweet." Not unkind, exactly. Just enough. Daniel didn't see it. He is like his father that way. Generous in his interpretations of people, always finding the most charitable explanation. I love that about my husband. With Margaret, I was less certain it was serving my son well. The dinner was on a Friday in March. There were 14 of us in that private room, Daniel's colleagues, a few close friends, Joanne and her husband, Margaret's parents who had flown in from Vancouver, and me. The room was warm and the food was good, and for the first hour I let myself simply be happy. Daniel looked well. He gave a short speech that was funny and genuine, and everyone laughed at the right moments. Then Margaret's father stood up. Gordon is a tall man, the kind of tall that seems to arrive in the room slightly before the rest of him. He had the deep, even tan of someone who golfs year-round, and the confidence of someone who has never once had to calculate whether he could afford to pick up a check. He tapped his glass and smiled and said he wanted to say a few words. I watched Margaret watch him. She sat a little straighter. "Daniel," Gordon began, "when my daughter first brought you home, I'll be honest, I had questions. You were a civil servant. Government work? Not exactly the kind of trajectory I'd mapped out for her." He laughed. A few people laughed with him, the nervous kind of laugh that happens when a room isn't sure yet whether something is a joke. "But you've proven yourself, and tonight we celebrate that. You've risen to a level where you can actually provide for my daughter the way she's accustomed to." The table went quiet in the specific way that quiet happens when everyone hears something, but no one wants to be the first to respond to it. Daniel smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. Margaret reached over and squeezed Gordon's arm, and she was smiling too, the wide, pleased smile of someone who had perhaps heard this speech rehearsed in advance. "And of course," Gordon continued, turning toward me with the magnanimous expression of a man distributing goodwill, "Catherine, you did your best with what you had. Daniel is a testament to that. It's not easy. raising children alone, working in, what was it, filing? He said, filing the way you say filing, efficient, administrative, invisible. The important thing is that Daniel now has the support system to really flourish. He raised his glass. To Daniel, who came a long way. People raised their glasses. A few said cheers. I looked at my son's face and I watched something there tighten and then carefully, deliberately go neutral. He had practiced that expression. He had needed it before. Joanne caught my eye from across the table. Her jaw was set. Her husband put his hand on her arm. I picked up my glass. I set it back down. Here is what Gordon did not know about me. What Margaret had perhaps never thought to mention, or mention correctly, or perhaps had simply never asked. I spent 15 years in medical records, yes, but before my husband got sick, before Daniel and Joanne were in school, before we moved to Merivale Road, I spent 9 years as a registered nurse at the Ottawa General Cardiac Care Unit. I left nursing when we had children because we made that choice together, my husband and I have never once regretted it. But I left with a license, with expertise, and with 11 years of relationships in that hospital that did not simply disappear because I changed my work hours. One of those relationships was with a cardiologist named Dr. Elaine Marsh. We had worked together closely. We stayed in touch, the occasional coffee, Christmas cards, and 6 years ago, when her clinic was growing and she needed someone trustworthy to manage their patient intake administration, she asked me. I said yes. I had been doing it ever since, not filing. Patient care coordination for a private cardiology clinic in the Glebe, managing a staff of 4, handling referrals from 12 physicians across the city. Margaret knew I worked at a clinic. She had never asked what I did there. But that is not the thing I was holding on to that night. The thing I was holding on to was a folder on my laptop at home and a directory I created 14 months earlier on a Tuesday evening when Margaret called Daniel from Calgary and I happened to be at his apartment feeding his cat while he was at a conference in Halifax. His laptop was open on the kitchen counter. I was not reading it. I was walking past it, and then I stopped. I want to be careful here about what I say I saw and what I actually saw. I am 63 years old, and I have lived long enough to know the difference between what you observe and what you conclude, and I have never been someone who draws conclusions from incomplete information, so I did not do anything that night. I fed the cat. I locked up. I drove home. But I remembered what I had seen. A name. A recurring name in an email preview that was not a colleague's name and not a family member's name, and not a name that matched any friend Daniel had ever mentioned in 11 years of dinners and phone calls and holidays. And the preview text, 3 lines visible before the screen went dark, which contained the words, "Miss you already," and "Don't forget Saturday," and something about a hotel in Kensington Market in Toronto. The name was Sophie. Over the following months, and I want to be clear that I was not surveilling my son's partner. I was a mother paying attention. Over the following months, I observed things. Margaret traveled to Toronto for work regularly. She worked in commercial real estate, and Toronto made sense, but the frequency increased, 4 times in 6 months. And twice she came home with a specific kind of careful brightness that I recognized, having once, briefly in my 30s, worn it myself during a period of my marriage I have never discussed with my children and which ended when I chose correctly. I did not share what I suspected with Daniel. I had no proof. I had a name and a hotel and the particular energy of someone returning from somewhere they were glad to have been. But I had also, in the way that nurses learn to document carefully, kept notes, dates, observations, things Margaret had said that contradicted other things she had said. The Calgary trip that Joanne mentioned offhand had been a girls' weekend, but Margaret had told Daniel it was a client meeting. Small things. The kind of small things that are invisible individually and form a pattern collectively. I had a folder. I had not decided what to do with it until that night in the private room in Westboro when Gordon raised his glass to my son who had come a long way and implied that my work was filing and my life was something to be graciously tolerated. I waited until the cheers settled. I waited until Gordon sat back down with the satisfied exhale of a man who believes he has been generous. I waited until the server arrived with the dessert menus and the conversation began to splinter into smaller exchanges. And then I stood up. I don't have a loud voice. I never have. But I have a voice that carries. 30 years of talking to patients in pain, to families in waiting rooms, to doctors in noisy corridors. You learn to pitch your voice so that it lands exactly where you intend it to land. "I'd like to say something," I said, "if that's all right." The table settled. Daniel looked at me with a small, uncertain smile. Joanne was very still. "Gordon, thank you for your words about my son. He is remarkable. And you're right that he came a long way." I paused just a moment. He came a long way the same way most people in this country come a long way, by working for it. His father was a teacher. I was a nurse. We did not have wealth management. We had RRSP contributions and a grocery list and a son we raised to understand that your value is not your postal code. I heard Margaret shift in her chair. "I want to say something about what that actually looked like," I continued, "because I think it's been mischaracterized tonight. I left nursing when my children were small because my husband and I made a decision together. Before that, I worked in the cardiac care unit at the Ottawa General for 9 years. After my husband passed, I returned to work. Not to filing, Gordon, but to managing patient care coordination for a cardiology clinic, a position I've held for 6 years. A position I was asked to take by a physician I had worked alongside in that unit. I mention this not because it matters to me what you think of it, but because my son grew up watching a woman work with competence and dignity, and I think he deserved to have that acknowledged correctly in a room full of people who love him. The room was very quiet now. Daniel was looking at me in a way I had not seen him look at me since he was perhaps 9 years old and had been crying and was trying very hard not to. I looked at Margaret. "Margaret," I said, and I kept my voice even. Kept it the way I had kept voices, even in the CCU at 2 in the morning when the news was not good. "I have watched you love my son imperfectly, the way we all love people imperfectly. And I have said nothing for a long time about things I observed because they were not my business, and it was not the right moment." She was very still. Her face had gone the careful blank of someone who does not yet know how much the other person knows. "I'm not going to make this the right moment either," I said. "Not tonight, not at Daniel's table. But I want you to know, and I want you to think carefully about this, that I kept notes. I kept them the way nurses keep notes, which is to say, thoroughly and with dates." I held her gaze. "I think there are conversations you need to have with my son, privately, soon, and honestly. Because the alternative is a conversation that involves all of us, and I don't believe that serves anyone, least of all you." Margaret's mother, beside her, had gone very still. Gordon's hand resting on the table had closed slowly around his dessert fork. I looked at Daniel one more time. He was watching me with an expression I cannot fully describe, somewhere between bewilderment and the dawning of something he had been working very hard not to dawn. "I am so proud of you," I told him. "I have been proud of you every single day. Your father would have been sitting here tonight beside himself with it." My voice caught, just slightly, and I did not apologize for that. "Congratulations, my love. Now who wants dessert?" I sat down. Joanne, across the table, picked up her glass very slowly and looked at me over the rim of it with the expression of someone watching a sporting event that has just turned decisively. The rest of the dinner was civil, the kind of civil that has considerable tension running underneath it, the way a river looks smooth from the bank. Gordon did not speak again, except to order the creme brulee. Margaret excused herself once to the bathroom and came back with the precise, composed face of someone who has made a decision. Daniel drove me home that night. We sat in his car in front of my house on Merival Road for a long time without speaking. "Mom," he said finally. "The notes." "Yes." "How long?" 14 months. He was quiet. Outside, a March wind was pushing the last of the dirty snow against the curb. Is it what I think it is?" he said. Not quite a question. "I don't know what you think," I told him carefully. "I know what I observed. I know what I documented. And I know you deserve to look at it and make your own conclusions." He called me the following Sunday. He had talked to Margaret. Margaret had not denied it, had not, in fact, tried very hard to deny it, which told its own story about how long she had been carrying it and perhaps how heavy it had become. They were separating. He was calm in the way people are calm when the shock of a thing is still sitting slightly outside them, not quite arrived yet. I drove over with food. Shepherd's pie, the way his father used to make it, with the proper mashed potato crust and the peas stirred in. We ate at his kitchen table and talked about other things. His new role, a hiking trip Joanne was planning, the leak in my back eaves that I'd been putting off fixing. The ordinary furniture of a life continuing forward. Before I left, he hugged me for a long time. "How did you know," he said, "when to say something?" I thought about that. I thought about all the years of watching and saying nothing, carrying information gently, waiting for the moment when silence would cost more than speech. I thought about his father, who had been a teacher because he believed in people's capacity to grow, and I thought about what it meant to protect someone versus what it meant to equip them. I said something. I told him, when staying quiet stopped being kind. He nodded. He walked me to my car. It is autumn now. Daniel has an apartment on Elgin Street, a good one, with a view of the canal. He cooks on Sundays. He has been spending time with a woman named Patricia, who works in environmental law and laughs easily and calls me Catherine, without being corrected. Last month, the three of us went to the farmer's market on a Saturday morning, and I walked behind them for a while, not intending to, just looking at the particular way they moved next to each other. Easy and unhurried, like two people who are not performing anything for anyone. I bought squash and late tomatoes and a jar of Ontario honey. On the drive home, I thought about Gordon's speech, about the word filing, about the long, careful years of making do and doing it with steadiness. I thought about the quilt my mother made that sits on the arm of my sofa, and about how some people would look at it and see the fraying at the corners, and some people would look at it and understand the patience it took to make something that would last. I have never needed anyone to tell me which kind of person I am. But it was nice, that evening in Westboro, to stand up and say it clearly. Once. In a room full of people. At a table set for 14. My son deserved to hear it. And honestly, so did I. I have thought a lot since that evening in Westboro about what it actually takes to stay quiet when staying quiet is the harder choice. People often mistake silence for weakness. They see a woman who doesn't raise her voice, who corrects her name twice and then simply stops correcting it, who sets down a coffee without comment and walks out of the room, and they read that as someone who can be dismissed. What they don't understand is that silence, chosen deliberately, is not the absence of power. It is the decision to wait until power can be used well. I was not quiet for 14 months because I was afraid of Gordon or Margaret or the West Vancouver version of the world they carried with them. I was quiet because I understood that acting too soon, from anger, from wounded pride, would have made the truth I held into something smaller. A grievance, a mother-in-law's complaint, easily categorized and set aside. I waited until there was a moment when the truth could land with its full weight in front of the right people and actually change something. That is not passivity. That is patience with a purpose behind it. There is a kind of cause and effect that operates quietly in the background of every life, and it has nothing to do with luck or fate. It is simply this: the choices you make about how to carry yourself, year after year, accumulate. Gordon spent decades believing that a person's worth could be read from their postal code, their income bracket, their professional title. That belief did not arrive from nowhere. He had been rewarded for it, surrounded by people who confirmed it, and so it grew. By the time he stood up at that dinner table, he had no idea that he was about to be undone by exactly the thing he had dismissed. He had dismissed careful, competent, quietly observant women his entire life. And one of them had been watching. Margaret made her own choices, separate from her father's. I do not carry anger toward her. Not now, not truly. But her choices produced consequences that were always going to arrive eventually, because concealment of that kind is not a permanent structure. It is a temporary one. What I did at that table did not cause the end of her marriage to Daniel. The end of that marriage was already built into the choices she had been making for the better part of a year. I simply changed the timeline. What I want to say, what I think matters in this, is that none of what I did that night came from a place I built overnight. It came from 30 years of choosing to do my work with honesty, to stay curious rather than bitter when life narrowed, to raise my children to understand that dignity is not granted to you by someone else's opinion of your income. My husband believed that. I watched him live it in a classroom for 3 decades with no particular audience and no reward beyond the work itself. That is what I learned from him. That is what I tried to give our children. When Daniel hugged me at his door that night and asked how I knew when to speak, I didn't have a clean answer for him then. I have one now. You speak when staying silent would make you complicit in something untrue. Not before. Not out of pride, not out of hurt, not because someone was rude to you at a dinner table. You wait until the moment when what you know and what you say can actually serve someone you love. That is the only calculation that matters. Everything else takes care of itself.